Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name's David Runciman. I'm just going to say a few words. I'm currently head of the Department of Politics and International Studies, and I'm just going to say a few words about this lecture series and about its benefactors. The Alcuin series was set up thanks to a very generous donation from Lord and Lady Britton, the late Leon Britton, and it was to establish a series of lectures about Britain's relationship with Europe. People who always ask who or what was Alcuin. Alcuin was an 8th century English theologian, poet, and philosopher who went to the court of Charlemagne, where he became a very significant and influential figure. So he is the name in whose honor this lecture series is run, because he's an early example of British engagement in Europe. And that is the theme of the series. It's had some very distinguished speakers over the years: Jose Manuel Barroso, Peter Mandelson, the former Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta, last year Neil Acheson, who spoke about Scotland's relationship with Europe. Enrico Letta spoke just 2.5 years ago, and his subject was Brexit. That is, it was the risks of Brexit, both the risk as he saw it 2.5 years ago that it really might happen, and also the risks for other European nations of its consequences. And my abiding memory of that lecture was, after he had finished speaking, somebody had to explain to the audience what Brexit meant, because many people there had never heard the word before. And that was 2.5 years ago. So times change very quickly. And I'm delighted that we have another very distinguished speaker to address some absolutely central themes relating to the event that is on all of our minds. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Chris Bickerton, who's going to chair tonight's event and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, David. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Greg Hands, MP, and I'm going to say a lot more about Greg just in a few moments. Now, David has said that the theme of this Alcuin Lecture is the relationship between Britain and Europe, or Britain's place in Europe. And Greg's professional career and his current political responsibilities will make very clear what that connection is today. But they're also, interestingly enough, also in Greg's personal sort of background, there is a strong connection to the theme of this lecture as well. Greg was born in the United States and came over to the UK when he was 7 years old. And after he completed secondary school, he did what at the time I think was probably not a very fashionable thing to do. When I did this, everyone was doing it and it was very fashionable, but he did back in 1984 a gap year. And he went to, of all places, West Germany. We have to, I think back, this was 1984. This was a year after Chancellor Helmut Kohl had been elected in what was a very divisive election in West Germany. He'd campaigned on a pro-US, on a pro-Western, on a pro-nuclear missiles ticket, and won, but it was a very closely run thing, and the country was very divided. There was a lot of hostility to the idea of US missiles being present on German territory. And so Greg travelled to very much the heart of the Cold War, and at the time few people thought that it would wind itself down so soon afterwards. Now, Greg maintained his interest and activities in Eastern Europe. He travelled very widely. He went back to West Germany a number of times. He speaks fluent French and German, and also very good Czech and Slovak. Now, it probably comes as no surprise that he studied modern languages at university. He studied here in Cambridge. He was at Robinson College, just up the road from here. Now, he went into banking initially before going into politics. We try not to hold that too much against him. He came back in the early 1990s to London and spent a long time working in local politics, and then he rose up to become a very important figure in the contemporary Conservative Party. Greg was MP for Hammersmith and Fulham between 2005 and 2010. Then there were some electoral boundary changes, and he was elected MP for Chelsea and Fulham constituency in 2010 after the introduction of these changes, and then re-elected as MP for that constituency in 2015. But prior to that, he worked for some time in the Whip's office, and then in 2015, after the elections, he became Chief Secretary at the Treasury. With the arrival of Theresa May as Prime Minister earlier this year, He became Minister of State for International Trade and serves today in effect as number 2 to Liam Fox at the ministry. So the title of today's lecture is Global Britain with a question mark, the future of British trade after Brexit. Now this reflects Greg's current responsibilities, of course, and we very much look forward to hearing what he has to say. And he's also said that he was very interested in having some questions afterwards, so we'll have a question and answer session. But for the moment, let me please ask you to give a very warm welcome to Greg Hands, MP.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, thank you very much indeed for that warm introduction. I think everybody can hear me. I can hear myself quite well. Can you hear me right at the back there, yeah? Excellent. Well, thank you. It is a pleasure, an honour and a great privilege to be back here in Cambridge this evening to deliver this year's Alcuin Lecture. And as you rightly pointed out, it is a prestigious list of lecturers to follow. Carl Bildt, former Swedish Prime Minister and quite recently Swedish Foreign Minister and former High Representative in Bosnia. Chris Patten, former EU Commissioner. Peter Mandelson, also a former EU Commissioner. Jose Manuel Barroso, the former President of the European Commission, and so on. So it's a very, very prestigious list of speakers you've had. And I don't for a moment necessarily want to equate myself to them, but I would say one thing, and that is that none of those speakers, great as they are, I think at the time they gave the lecture, were involved themselves at the heart of government at a time of something as both critical and as topical as Brexit. There is quite a lot of work for me to do at the moment, so it is a rare evening out for me to be able to come back here to Cambridge and join you this evening, and thank you for that welcome again. And as you rightly say, this lecture is part of a series set up by Lord Britton on Britain's role in Europe. And I should start by joining you, David, in paying tribute to him just a little bit, I think, just a little bit more than a year on from his death. And who was really a great servant for the country, for my party, the Conservative Party, and in many ways for Britain in Europe. Controversial that may now seem to say that, but I think he did a very, very good job for the country. And speaking of Leon Britton, I'm sure you might want to have at some point the only other MP who attended Robinson College, namely Nick Clegg, as he actually worked for Leon Britton in Brussels at the time in the 1990s. But I leave that to you, the organisers, to perhaps work out your future programme of speakers to organise. Now, I think as you rightly said, my first-class Cambridge education might have been an ideal training ground for myself in European politics. I actually graduated in history, mainly 20th century German and Eastern European history, but I was also in and out of both the modern languages and Oriental Studies faculties. I don't know if you can still switch around quite as much as I used to in Tripos. In fact, at times I think I used to specialise in convincing different supervisors that I was in a different faculty at that time, which is why I'd missed that particular supervision that day. But I did parts of German, Czech and Slovak, Turkish and Arabic, some of which I've retained to this day. I would say the ones nearer to the beginning of that list of languages rather than the end, and served me well in my new environment of promoting the UK's role in trade. And I'm particularly close to all things German. My wife is German, my children are bilingual, and as you rightly pointed out in your introduction, I lived before coming to Robinson in what was then called West Berlin, and spent actually most of my university vacations there as well. In fact, I generally used to hitchhike from Cambridge to actually, I'd go by train to Cambridge to Harwich and then hitchhike from the Hook of Holland to Berlin, which these days I think would be quite hard to imagine, but at the time was relatively straightforward, given the large number of British forces in northern Germany and Berlin. It was actually generally easier to do that than to get the train. But from West Berlin, I developed a close knowledge of the captive nations of Eastern Europe and the alternative Soviet socialist system at the time, which now it seems like a distant history. But in the 1980s, of course, nobody really had the benefit of hindsight in history and being able to see what was going to happen really just 4 years after that. And these days, you have to travel a long way to see a fundamentally different political system. When you think about it, at that time, going to West Berlin took under 24 hours, and you could pop over to East Berlin really in about 20 minutes. Now it's a terribly long way to travel to get to anywhere close to that in terms of what you would see to say Pyongyang, Havana, or Caracas. And I became acquainted with European business and economics during my time as a financial trader in London and New York before entering politics. And I think, as you mentioned, the fact I was a banker, and upon entering Parliament, I was probably one of the few of the new intake who could say they'd moved into a less unpopular profession, becoming a Member of Parliament at the time. But I'm here tonight in my capacity as Minister of State for Trade and Investment at the newly formed Department for International Trade. The evening's lecture is entitled Global Britain, the Future of British Trade After Brexit. And on reflection, I must admit it's a title that is full of hidden meanings and ambiguity. What exactly is Global Britain? What kind of trading environment does Britain want to help foster in the world? And what does Brexit means Brexit actually really mean? So I'll touch on all of these questions during the course of this lecture, but I'd like to leave you all with this thought, that Britain will always be a great trading nation, and going forward we aim to be the most fervent champion of global free trade. It is my job and that of my department to ensure that we continue to strive to this ambition. Now, leaving the EU doesn't mean leaving Europe, and I see no contradiction with seeing a bright future for the UK outside the European Union, yet maintaining and even strengthening our links with our European neighbours. But more of this to come shortly. Now, on the 24th of June, I didn't wake up and feel any less European. I campaigned on the Remain side in the referendum on the 23rd of June and worked quite hard, in vain, of course. But I campaigned for that side, and my abiding memory of the Friday, the 24th of June, well, actually the first memory, I've got many memories of that day, because it seemed like about 10 years of politics was squeezed into a period of about 3 or 4 hours on that day. But my first memory was of my then 8-year-old, half English, half German son in tears at the result. I think unsure what the implications were. If you thought that we were unsure what the implications might mean, imagine being a child of British and German parents, being able to figure what this thing called Brexit and Britain leaving, or seemingly Britain leaving Europe, or potentially Britain leaving Europe, what that might mean for an 8-year-old child. But I take a pragmatic view of Brexit, and in any case, being European is an intrinsic part of my British identity and always will be. And if we're short of inspiration, we only need to delve into this country's rich trading history. And there's no better place to start with Alcuin himself. As has been pointed out, Alcuin was a true European. Born and raised in York, his great intellect brought him to the court of Charlemagne, whose Carolingian empire stretched across the continent like a proto-EU, encompassing France, Germany, Italy, the Low Countries, northern Spain, and so on. And then, rather like as now, Britain stood apart from the continent. Yet while the Channel protected our island from the military might of Charlemagne and the various rivals to him, it also acted as a conduit for trade. Letters from the period, many of them in Alcuin's own hand, make reference to the English ships that arrived every day at Carolingian ports across France and the Low Countries. And these missives actually represent the first documents of English diplomatic history. Among the negotiations of marriage, guarantees to protect travellers, there are constant references to the commercial interests that bridged the Channel at the time. Charlemagne himself mentions the fine English cloth that was highly prized by the Franks. And it is telling that even as diplomatic relations deteriorated, trade was protected and permitted to flourish. And I just ask people to dwell on that for a moment, that even as diplomatic relations deteriorated, trade was protected and permitted to flourish on all sides. Now, Charlemagne himself was actually bringing us suddenly jarring up to date, was unknowingly at the center of a classic British-German misunderstanding 1,200 years later. Margaret Thatcher had famously frosty relations with German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who we've already referred to this evening. And Kohl decided in the 80s that he needed to show Mrs. Thatcher a more human side and invited her to stay at his homeland, in his homeland of the Rhineland. And he decided to take her to Aachen Cathedral and showed her the grave of Charlemagne. It was supposed to be a small part of a simple local history tour, but Kohl's English was unusually poor for a German leader, and Mrs. Thatcher couldn't speak any German. And somehow Mrs. Thatcher was given the impression that Kohl wanted to be the next Charlemagne. Now, to this day, I think at the heart of this was a mistranslation of the German word groß, which in German means both large and great. Charlemagne is in German Karl der Große, and I think this was probably mistranslated somehow as large. And Mrs. Thatcher somehow started the whole chain reaction to misinterpret this as somehow a representation to Helmut Kohl, who was, I think, 6'4" and a very large man in front of her. And there wasn't a reference to Charlemagne at all, it was a reference to Kohl. And they fell out. Relations were even worse when she returned from the Rhineland after that particular chapter, convinced that Kohl wanted to be the new modern-day Charlemagne. But returning to history, England continued to trade throughout the Middle Ages, with London, York, and Norwich prospering from trading fine woolen cloth with the Hanseatic League right the way across Europe, in exchange for timbers and furs at its most basic level. In the ensuing centuries, we pioneered innovative transport networks in this country, dredging canals, laying the world's first rail track throughout the country to transport goods faster and more efficiently than ever before. We ushered in the first and second industrial revolutions. From the repeal of the Corn Laws, a very important date in British history, 1846, Britain was the preeminent voice for global free trade. And from the signing of the world's first ever free trade pact, the Cobden-Chevalier Agreement of 1860, to the establishment of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, in 1947, examples of our British dedication to the principles of free trade are scattered across our country's history. Trade, in short, is in our DNA. We have always been an outward-looking, big-thinking country, and that won't change as a result of Brexit. This nation of shopkeepers, as Napoleon famously quipped, has sold wine to France and tea to China. And let's bear this in mind as I move on to the events of the past few months. Now, on the 23rd of June, the British people issued a clear instruction to the government. As I said, I campaigned for the Remain side, including here in Cambridge. But I'm a democratic politician, and I recognise a mandate when I see one, a 1.2 million person majority for leaving the European Union. Indeed, more British people have voted to leave the EU than have voted for anything else ever. Brexit means Brexit is simply the acceptance of the democratic will of the British people, regardless of whether you voted in or out. To try and remain in the Union by stealth or through a back door would be to undermine the very values that we purport to live by, and would, in my view, unleash a significant and probably greater crisis in this country. For all of us, the task is now to make a success of Brexit, to ensure that leaving the European Union does not compromise our prosperity, our society, or our values. And we in government must seize this opportunity to reshape the United Kingdom's relations with the rest of the world. We must always be clear that to leave the European Union is not to turn in on ourselves or to become introspective. Instead, the United Kingdom can retain its preeminence by positioning itself at the heart of an increasingly interconnected world. And I believe that we as a nation are uniquely placed to capitalize on the era of globalization. Britain is intrinsically internationalist. There are some who doubt Britain's ability to thrive in this new world, so let me just provide 3 rebuttals to those doubts. First, while our future trading relationship with the EU is yet to be determined, it is clearly in both the UK's and the EU's interests to strike a mutually beneficial future arrangement. The EU has a £60 billion trade surplus with the UK. Put it in perspective, that is bigger than this country's annual defence budget. And of the 10 markets with which we have our biggest trade deficits, 7 are in the EU. So 7 of our top 10 trade deficits in size are with the European Union. From our side, 44% of UK exports go to the European Union, more than to any other market anywhere in the world. And that, I believe, should provide the raw materials for our deal for the future, that interconnection and interreliability. And drilling down below the headline numbers, of course, our supply chains, very important in today's globalized industrial world, are increasingly intertwined. Taking just one example, Airbus's fully integrated European manufacturing network, with wings built in South Gloucestershire, tail fins in Getafe in Spain, final assembly in Toulouse, and paint and interior work taking place in Hamburg. Our largest supermarket, Tesco, not always the most popular example, but operates an integrated supply chain that services 4 big Central European markets. And if you look at the European car industry, you'll see that parts have crisscrossed the channel for decades, and increasingly so. 1 in 5 BMW engines are made in the United Kingdom. It is clear that a messy divorce in trade, as in life, would benefit neither partner. Now, over the past weeks and months, much has been said about whether the UK would be better off with a so-called hard Brexit or with a so-called soft Brexit, as though the question was, how do you like your Brexit each morning? The issue here is that the UK is neither like Norway or Switzerland, nor like Canada or Turkey. We cannot simply transplant other models and make it work for us. What we need is a model that is right for the United Kingdom, one that ensures our current strengths, such as ICT, automotive, aerospace, and financial services, are protected, and one which recognises our historic and unique trading relationship with our European neighbours. And in keeping with the breakfast analogy, I think my former colleague William Hague was onto something when he called for a Goldilocks Brexit, an arrangement that is just right for Britain. And over the past few months, my colleagues and I have been speaking to UK and overseas businesses. In fact, that's what I spend most of my day doing, so that we start designing a future trading relationship with the EU and the rest of the world that is right for British businesses and consumers, as well as those around the world. Now, I've recently visited, just in the last few weeks since the new department was established in July, all of the US, South Korea, Taiwan, Germany, Turkey, where I spoke to a variety of business associations. I reassured them that Britain remains open for business and tried to understand their priorities and challenges around trade, and asked what this government can do to help to ease the process. And by the way, I was also able to do some promotion of Cambridge University on the side, taking time out with a leading Korean corporation to seek their sponsorship of the proposed Korean Studies Centre here, a project which I first discussed with my former Oriental Studies head of department, Professor, now Deputy Warden of Robinson College, Professor Peter Kornicki, some years earlier. But returning to the matter in hand, it's important to note that we want the EU to succeed, we just don't want to be governed by it. This is not a zero-sum game. Both the EU and a UK outside of it can prosper together. And as we leave, we intend to do so in a way that ensures minimal disruption for our European partners, with whom we will continue to have strong economic, political and security bonds. As I said before, we are leaving Europe and we are rejoining at the same time the rest of the world. The second basis for why we should have reason to be optimistic is that the UK is now better equipped than ever to thrive in this new world, thanks to changes in the machinery of government. Now, governments are not usually known for being fleet of foot, but this government reacted within weeks of the vote on the 23rd of June to establish two new government departments, the Department for International Trade and the Department for Exiting the European Union. Both will ensure not only that the UK leaves the EU smoothly, but that we become a beacon of open trade when we do. And I'm delighted that for the first time in many years, international trade has its rightful place back at the heart of government, with a seat at the cabinet table for the first time in decades. When the UK trades with the world, our economy is stronger, our societies and public services are healthier, and we cement our role as a key, powerful player on the world stage. Trade is fundamental to the prosperity of the United Kingdom and the world economy. Our trade with the world is equivalent to over half of our national income. Free trade is a significant job creator, provides us with goods and services from around the world, and increases our pay packets. It has also helped raise the living standards of people around the world, showing that the moral case for free trade is just as important as the economic one. And our Department for International Trade has broadly three areas of focus. First, we will promote British goods and services across the world, find and develop new markets, and foster a new and vibrant export culture. Second, we want to continue attracting the levels of foreign investment into the UK that has made us the leading European destination for foreign direct investment. And also, crucially, we need to refocus our efforts on our own overseas direct investment. In other words, investment coming out of this country into foreign markets, maximising our overseas earnings and ensuring that UK investors are securing healthy returns. This is essential if we are to rebalance our current account, which stands at a record deficit. And finally, the third and final area of our new government department, we will begin to take on the functions of trade policy, including trade negotiations, for when we leave the EU, as well as continuing to push for a fairer, rules-based system for global trade and investment, not only in goods, but also in services. The department, for the first time, brings together the three pillars of trade: promotion, finance, and policy, all under one roof. And we will rally the whole of government, industry, and one of the largest overseas diplomatic networks in the world to champion UK PLC. Now, we do not underestimate the scale of the challenge that faces us, and let's just take exports for a moment as an example. The UK has experienced a deteriorating trade performance since 2011, with our exports growing more slowly than some of our G7 counterparts, including the United States, Germany and France. And by the way, I might just add there, the UK economic performance in that time has been the best or equal best amongst the G7. So specifically our export performance has been disappointing. Only 11% of UK businesses at all export anything beyond our shores. And only 6 to 7% of our goods exporters sell to high-growth markets such as China and Japan. Exports as a percentage of GDP of our total national output each year in the UK are actually the lowest of all 28 EU members, at 21%. Exports as a percentage of GDP are just 21%. The second lowest is Greece at 22.5%. Germany is at 35%. And there's no getting away from these disappointing figures, and they lay bare so much unfulfilled potential in our economy. However, there are actually some excellent examples of what can be achieved when ambitious and innovative British businesses start looking further afield. In 1975, just a stone's throw away from my constituency, of Chelsea and Fulham, in a South Kensington flat, the first ever designs of a folding bicycle were drawn up. It was an innovation that set the cycling world alight. And now cyclists pedal Brompton bikes in cities like Cambridge, like Tokyo, Chengdu, Barcelona, Hamburg, and so on, to name a few. With 80% of its bikes exported to 44 markets, Brompton is a shining example of how highly British innovation, quality, and heritage is perceived around the world. The truth is that it has never been easier to export than it is today. With the growth of e-commerce, you can now export from your garage, living room, or local coffee shop. Now, who here owns or knows someone who owns a satchel from the Cambridge Satchel Company? I can see a few hands go up. It was a business idea conceived around a kitchen table in this very city, which owes its very existence to e-commerce. From 3 bags a week to 300 and then to 3,000, all in the space of the first 3 years, the company now sells to over 80 markets around the world and is even listed on Tmall, China's biggest e-marketplace, which gets 100 million visitors a day. Now, research shows that companies that export are more profitable, resilient, and productive. My department wants businesses to move the conversation on from a question like, should I export, to why am I not already exporting? Now, for those who say there isn't a demand for their products overseas, we have a campaign called Exporting is Great, part of the government's great branding, which I hope you will have seen at some point in recent years, that shows to UK businesses thousands of live overseas business opportunities. Now, for those who say there isn't enough support, I would say the level of support for exports is unprecedented. We have around 60 commercial partners as part of Exporting is Great, from logistics firms to telecoms, all standing ready to help UK firms on their export journey. And finally, for those who say it's simply too difficult, we will soon launch the world's first directory of UK exporters so overseas buyers can easily find the UK exporter that's right for them. The third and final reason why I believe the UK will succeed outside of the EU is because of our strong economic fundamentals and world-beating capability. Now, as a former Treasury Minister, I know better than some the strength and resilience of the British economy. We are the 6th largest economy in the world, which even post-referendum is seeing the highest employment rates in history, low and stable inflation, and the highest manufacturing output for 2 years. Recently, the IMF revised their post-referendum predictions downwards, but still to say that Britain will actually be the fastest growing G7 nation this year. So despite Brexit, still growing faster than either France, Germany, or Italy. And our world-leading capability is spread right across the UK. In the northwest of England, a car rolls off the production line in Jaguar Land Rover's Halewood plant every 80 seconds, en route to 170 different countries worldwide. The East Midlands, as a region, is one of the largest assemblers of jet engines in the world, whereas the West Midlands is the only UK region which has a goods surplus with China, valued at around £1 billion. London is a world leader in financial services, and did you know that Scotland exports 38 bottles of whiskey every single second? In fact, the Scots sell more whiskey in a month than France sells cognac in a year. But I am delighted that Cambridge is Europe's largest technology cluster. It's changed out of all recognition since I left as an undergraduate in 1989. Around 57,000 people are employed by the more than 1,500 technology-based firms in the area, which have combined annual revenue of over £13 billion. And this is why investment has continued to pour into the UK since the referendum. You may have heard of GSK's, GlaxoSmithKline's recent announcement to spend £275 million on 3 factory sites here in the UK. and of Japanese firm SoftBank's purchase of Cambridge's very own Arm, Britain's largest technology company. And actually, it shouldn't surprise anyone why this is the case. We are the highest ranked major economy for ease of doing business. And that is, I think, one of this country's great selling points as we go forward from here. According to the World Bank, the highest ranked major economy for ease of doing business. We have a system of commercial law that is envied around the world and which underpins the trust that many investors place in the UK. We have a low regulation and low tax economy. We're in the right time zone for global trading, and we have a highly skilled English-speaking workforce. These are the UK's credentials and the reasons why, in or out of the EU, the world knows we are open for business. Before I finish, I want to talk about global Britain and what it means for me. If anything, I hope that what I've already said today shows that Britain has always been and continues to be outward-looking and internationalist. Global Britain is a country with the self-confidence and the freedom to look to our economic and diplomatic opportunities in every corner of the globe. We should constantly seek to position ourselves at the centre of this increasingly interconnected world to help shape our environment rather than be shaped by it. It means using our enviable position in some of the most powerful alliances and organizations in the world. The UN Security Council as a permanent member, NATO as a founding member, the G7 as a founding member, the G20 as a founding member, and the Commonwealth right at the centre, to push for a global environment centred on a strong rule of law, a democratic spirit, and open, tolerant societies. Let us also not forget the cultural aces up our sleeves that are also crucial also to our global influence. Now I am standing here, you are sat here today in one of 4 UK universities that are consistently ranked in the top 10 throughout the world. We have more Nobel laureates than any country outside America. The Premier League is the most watched football league in the world, and the BBC World Service is the largest international broadcaster, broadcasting in 28 languages to almost 250 million people worldwide. And to come second in both the Olympics and the Paralympics this summer shows just what can be achieved by a determined nation of just under 65 million people. I am confident about our nation's future. But where I think Britain could play its most effective global role now is to lead the charge for a system of freer and fairer trade. There is a growing protectionist instinct rearing its head in some countries, including the United States. And according to a recent report by the World Trade Organization, it's actually some of the G20 countries that are the biggest culprits for throwing up new barriers to global free trade. In a globalized world, the concepts of time and distance are becoming increasingly irrelevant. The proliferation of technology has created a global customer base and the most mobile and information-rich world population in history. The pace of change is incredible. We live in a world where by 2020, 80% of the adult population will own a smartphone, where there are currently well over 1 billion websites, and where Palmerston, the Foreign Office cat, has more than doubled my Twitter followers, yet has only posted 58 times. The more we retreat into our shells, the further we will fall behind in the global race, and for the UK, this is not an option. We all know the benefits of free trade. Consumers benefit from a competitive marketplace, which leads to cheaper, more innovative and better quality products. Businesses benefit from a shop window of products from across the world, products from continents, rather than individual towns or cities. For example, in the year before the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement was signed, the UK sold just over 2,000 cars to South Korea. 3 years later, that number reached over 13,000. Businesses also benefit from the flow of knowledge and ideas across borders, which make them more productive. But the moral aspect of free trade is also worth noting. You will struggle to find an international aid package that has been more effective in emancipating the world's poor than open trade. Look at China and India, and you'll see a correlation between those economies starting to liberalize and the emergence of hundreds of millions of their people above the poverty line. Of course, globalization has not benefited everyone equally. While its benefits are often widely dispersed and sometimes overlooked, the impact on certain industries and certain areas of the country by the pace of technological change is acute and concentrated. People can be left disillusioned and disaffected. Now, what may now be a career-limiting move, I'm going to echo what Peter Mandelson said in this very lecture 8 years ago. He spoke of what he called the Openness Boom, which was the term he attributed to the integration of huge swathes of the world's population into the global economy. I agree with his diagnosis in that, and I quote, "If the progressive challenge in the 20th century was to humanize capitalism, its work in this century is to humanize the openness boom." We should be bold with our ideas and policies to ensure that when we open ourselves up to the world, we aren't at the same time turning our back on those who may be struggling to adapt. This means investing in our people through education, skills, and retraining, so that through trade we can build a society that benefits the many over the few. We must also warn of the dangers of insularity. While protectionism is often popular in the short term, and sometimes a vote winner in limited areas, the tragic irony, it is normally the poorest in society that lose out as a result. If America was closed to trade, its poorest people would forfeit 62% of their purchasing power. The price of everyday products would skyrocket. The very same arguments that were made over 150 years ago in this country against the Corn Laws are still relevant today. But where other nations are hanging back, a global Britain will carry the standard of free and open trade as a badge of honour. The Prime Minister said she wanted the UK to be the most passionate, the most consistent, and the most convincing advocate of free trade anywhere in the world. We will continue to work with the World Trade Organization, within the World Trade Organization, to build on its successful work in eradicating red tape across borders, phasing out distorting export subsidies, and scrapping trillions of dollars worth of tariffs. However, where progress has stalled at the multilateral level, the UK must be ready to look to more bespoke plurilateral and bilateral arrangements in trade to ensure that the global marketplace remains fair and free. So in conclusion, we have just been through potentially, I stress potentially, one of the most transformative times in British political history. In a time of tumultuous change and uncertainty, it is reassuring that we can always fall back on the ideals and values that have shaped this great country: democracy, a strong rule of law, tolerant societies, and a willingness to engage with the world. Free and open trade is a key part of that. It has given us our influence, importance, and prosperity. And if we are to embrace the world, we must, like Alcuin and the Carolingians, recognize the preeminence and importance of global free trade. We now have a golden opportunity to do so, and I am confident that we will not waste that opportunity. Thank you.
So the Minister has said that he's happy to take some questions. We've got about 20 minutes or so for a Q&A session. So please raise your hands. We've got, I think, just the one roving mic for the moment. So Ollie's going to have to work very hard. I can see a hand up there in the middle, and just keep them coming, and I'll try and remember.
Do you think that you're going to be able to negotiate a trade deal within 2 years of Article 50, especially given that Canada has taken over 7 years to negotiate a trade deal with the EU? And what's going to happen in the meantime between the end of Article 50 and the end of the negotiations? Will we have to go to WTO trade tariffs?
Yeah, very good question. First thing to say, of course, first thing that we need to work out as we go into, as you all know, the Prime Minister said that Article 50 won't be triggered this year, and it won't be triggered later than the end of March 2017. First thing we need to work out is what kind of a future relationship we want with the European Union itself in relation to things like the single market, the customs union, and so on. In terms of where we are after that, I'm actually confident of our ability to come to good agreements that will benefit this country. You will have seen that the EU is struggling. This is where I think some of the opportunities of Brexit come in. You will have seen, for example, that the EU is struggling to come to a free trade agreement with Canada. Now, Canada, I think most people in this room, whatever you think about different global players out there, different countries in the world, Canada, I think most people would agree, is sort of one of the more sort of benign and friendly countries to the United Kingdom, probably anywhere in the world. And the EU is struggling to come to an agreement with Canada, which I think you rightly mentioned, the length of time that it's taken to negotiate that. Part of the reason for that is actually due to the fact that you've got to pass, because it's a mixed agreement, through all 28 member states of the European Union, including, in some cases, regional parliaments. And you will have seen that the reason the CETA, the EU-Canada agreement, is being held up at the moment is the Walloon Parliament in Belgium has decided that they don't like the look of CETA. Now, I think here, and this is sad, by the way, for us, the UK government, we strongly support CETA. Even though we're leaving the European Union, we think it's in this country's interests for CETA to be signed. More importantly, we think it's in the interests of global free trade generally for the EU to come to a free trade agreement with Canada. Having said that, I think one of the opportunities of Brexit is the ability to be more fleet of foot in being able to do free trade agreements in the future. So instead of negotiating with 28 different countries, and let's face it, some of the countries of the EU are significantly more protectionist in instinct than the United Kingdom is. So the ability to negotiate and deliver on free trade agreements more readily than, say, the European Union as a whole may well be, depending, notwithstanding our future status with the EU itself, may well be the sort of thing that gives the UK a big advantage going forward. And how long? Well,
We're going to have to negotiate with 27 countries in the EU.
Yeah. Well, that will depend on each particular case. I mean, I can envisage there may be cases where it may make sense if we wanted to get into a free trade agreement with a particular country, that we simply had the ability to translate that agreement from the EU to read the UK in its most simplest form. In other words, we carry on the status quo as if the UK was still in the European Union in that particular case. It may be that we want to have a bespoke agreement. It may be we want to have an agreement that covers more than the EU free trade agreement would have covered. For example, I imagine the UK might have different priorities to the rest of the European Union in things like agriculture, in things like car production and so on. So different cases. I think it'll be a case-by-case approach. In terms of the length of time it would take, I think the UK's ability to negotiate, I think, will be faster than the European Union as a whole in most cases. The precise time that it will take to negotiate individual free trade agreements is a little bit too early to tell. What I can tell you is we have set up trade working groups already, or I should say, correct myself, announced the setting up of trade working groups with Australia, with India, with New Zealand. That is the very first stage to scope out the potential for the topics within a future free trade agreement with those markets.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've got there are quite a few hands at the back, so I'm going to come down to the front, but we're going to let Ollie sort of cover the back there. So if you've got somebody at the very back, and then work your way down. Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for this interesting lecture. You stressed a lot the benefits of free trade worldwide for all countries. And I would want to ask, how would you say free trade benefits poor farmers in places like sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia when international companies import food products at much lower prices?
Yeah. Well, okay, I think the ability actually, free trade, if it's done properly, and if it's done in a way that brings people in, and the ability for farmers to sell their products into, for example, European markets, which I think has sometimes been a difficulty with the European Union in terms of its ability to take products from the developing world, particularly due to agricultural protectionism in the rest of the European Union in particular. And I think the UK sets a very good example. You'll know from UK supermarkets it's significantly easier to buy products from, for example, Kenya, for example, from Ghana, from other countries of sub-Saharan Africa than it is in many EU markets. And I think our ability to be welcoming to agricultural products from sub-Saharan Africa, I think is going to be one of the key tests of making sure that free trade works also for those in developing countries. It's clearly worked for developing countries in the past, recently developing countries, the likes of which are now really on almost in some cases on a par with us, like South Korea, Taiwan, increasingly China, India. I think it could be made to work for sub-Saharan Africa as well, which I think is already starting to be the case. But that I think will be a key priority, and actually one in which the UK is very well placed due to our historic connections, due to the use of the English language across large tracts of sub-Saharan Africa, and our trading connections. I think the UK can be very well placed to assist in that space.
Okay. There was somebody in the red there, in the pink top. Yeah, that's.
Thank you very much. I have a question about EU law. Does your department have a policy on how to organize the EU legal framework after the Brexit? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to pass on that because that's probably a better question to put to the department for exiting the European Union. But I think you'll have seen that'll be part of the negotiation which will begin once Article 50 has been triggered, the future of EU law and all of its various EU laws that are already transposed into UK law. The future of those will be a key part of that.
Okay. Are there any more in the sort of top half? Yep, there's a couple more. One in the very middle and then one on the right-hand side.
Hello there, thank you. I just wanted to know, how would you address the obvious ideological voids between those people seeing Brexit as an inward-looking phenomenon like Farage and other people, and people like yourself who see it as a golden opportunity to spread out into the world and to reaffirm Britain's place as a global trading power?
Yeah, well, let me try and answer that. I have to recognise that I was a Remain person. Okay, so my mission is to say the people have spoken, and it's up to us now to deliver on what the people wanted, which is Brexit. So I see within that challenges and opportunities. So I'm neither somebody who says we need to try to thwart Brexit or stop it somehow, or someone who's saying that Brexit will be the answer to all of this country's issues and problems. Yeah, if you like, I'm somewhere sort of in the middle. But I think I understand your question between the tensions, which I think were already there, by the way, before the 23rd of June, on the Leave side of the debate, between the Farages on the one side and the sort of the Goves and the Johnsons and whatever on the other side. What I would say to that is that I think the internationalists within the Leave side are the ones who are represented within government. So I think the outward-looking view of the potential and the opportunities on Brexit are those that are represented within government. That's not to say that the government hasn't also heard some of the messages, particularly I'll say on migration, that were also there within that vote as well. And it's a question, I think, of finding the right combination that ensures our future prosperity, our global trading patterns, our ability to do business around the world while still being consistent with wanting to do something on the migration side to bring down the numbers while still remaining open to the best and the brightest from around the world, including at this fine university.
Okay. Yep. The woman in the blue there at the back. Yep.
Thank you very much for a very nice talk. You made some very good points for why it's mutually or should be mutually beneficial for both the UK and the EU to negotiate a good deal on both sides with regards to the economy, trade, etc. But how do you address the fact that from the EU's point of view, that in their interests as well to essentially make an example of us, because from their point of view, while it may be better for them from a trade point of view, it's also better for them to prevent future states from leaving and essentially the EU falling apart. Would they not possibly be prepared to take a hit on this one in order to avoid future consequences?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a question that gets put to me quite often. And what I would say really are two things to that. First of all, I was clear in the lecture I gave, and this is the perspective of the UK government as a whole. We want the EU to succeed. There are people in this country who hate the EU, wish it had never been created, want it to fail. But I think there's a tiny minority, perhaps the Nigel Farages of the world. I think even those who are on the Leave campaign from the Conservative side fundamentally did not wish any ill on the European Union. And that is key. I think the UK government, it's in our interest for the EU to be successful, for it to work, and actually, as it happens, for the Eurozone actually to be a success and for it to work as well. I mean, that's probably even more controversial to say that. So I would say this, I don't see the UK, genuinely don't see the UK leading to other EU countries wanting to leave the European Union. I think that since the 23rd of June, all of the EU applicant countries, I don't think I've seen any of them withdraw their application. The Serbias, the Bosnias, the Albanias of the world, all of those queuing up to join the EU. I don't think any of them has said, well, actually, we think what the Brits are doing is quite right, we're no longer going to apply. I don't think I've seen any of the other 27 members say that we're interested in following the UK example. I think most of them respect the decision of the people of the United Kingdom. So I would say loud and clear to the other 27 nations in the European Union that it is not in the UK's interest for anybody, for the EU to be weakened in that way. And I don't personally see any other country following us. I see a handful of political movements in different EU countries coming out with various degrees of Euroscepticism. And it's not really for me to kind of comment on the internal politics of other countries. But I genuinely don't see the UK offering, if you like, a blueprint for other EU countries to follow. So I would say I think the European Union should have no fear of Brexit leading to other countries wishing to follow suit. I genuinely don't. So if that is the case, I would say that is not something that we would want to encourage. In fact, rather the opposite, in the sense we want to have a strong European Union, a strong and successful European Union going forward. I don't think there's any cause to have those fears. And that, by the way, is the message I give out in European capitals as well. Even countries with key elections coming up next year, and there's some very important national elections across the European Union next year, the Netherlands, France, Germany, where there are Eurosceptic politicians, but I don't see other EU countries wanting to follow what Britain decided to do on the 23rd of June.
Okay. We've got time for just another sort of 5 minutes or so. I promised the front half the opportunity to answer some questions. So can you put your hands up if you want? Okay, if you come down here on my right-hand side, and then we'll just come across, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Minister. What happens if this time of Brexit isn't actually a time of free trade? Indeed, what if fears about global free trade is actually a cause of Brexit? Donald Tusk this morning tweets something along the lines of, well, this could be our last free trade agreement that we try and do with Canada, because if we cannot persuade our citizens or that free trade is in their interests, we're just not going to make this work. So what happens if the situation in the Fulham Parliament turns out to be symptomatic of a wider concern about free trade and in whose interests it will be, and where that will leave the UK? And it's not just then the case that makes it difficult for the EU, for Canada to do a deal with the EU. You were kind of suggesting there may then be a kind of substitution effect, which if Canada can't do a free trade deal with the EU, it could then do it with a kind of post-Brexit UK. But the combined trade in goods between Canada and the EU is about 67 billion. Our trade in goods with the EU is about 470 billion. That kind of substitution effect isn't going to work. So firstly, how are you going to really deal with the problem of this may not actually be a good time to be the champion of free trade that you're suggesting?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And believe me, I think that's something that we look at and we study very, very closely, right the way across government in terms of the rhetoric and positions on free trade out there. It wouldn't have escaped many people, the rhetoric in the US presidential election, to be honest, from both main candidates, is not been particularly favourable to free trade in recent weeks during the debates. And I would say really two things to that. First of all, I think we, and the Prime Minister has been absolutely key on this, the UK, that creates a role for the UK. We have to win that argument. You know, in the same way, I'm going to be a little bit ideological about it, but the same way in the Cold War, we made the argument for democracy. We made the argument for free markets first time around, and we won that argument in 1989, 1990, etc. You know, I think we have to make and continue making that argument for free trade, and the onus is really all of us who believe in free trade to be making those arguments both domestically in the UK and internationally. So I think it's something we have to take on. But I agree with you, it is something which concerns me. The good news is that I can say that there's a lot of countries out there in the world queuing up with interest in discussing future free trade agreements with the UK. I mentioned the working groups that have been set up, but I mentioned a little bit of the travel that I've been doing in recent months, talking about those. My colleague, Lord Price, who leads for us on trade policy. There's a large number of countries and markets out there looking to liberalise their trade with the United Kingdom, and their enthusiasm for free trade is undimmed in many, many parts of the world. And I think the role for the UK will be to be an evangelist for free trade as we go forward from here, because we can't take it for granted. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of people out there who, for different political reasons, and there has been really, actually, when you think about it, the last 25 years or even longer. I mean, talking about US presidential elections, I remember Ross Perot in 1992, who won 19% of the vote, which then, for a third-party candidate, was pretty much unprecedented in recent times, pretty much on a pure protectionist platform, taking votes from both the Republicans and from the Democrats to build a 19% vote for a third party on purely that sort of protectionism. So you can't take it for granted, and the UK, I think, will be right at the centre of making that case.
A couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up. There's one on the end, and then we're going to take one in the very middle, and then there are going to be drinks afterwards, and there'll be plenty of opportunities to try and get your questions into the Minister then. So a couple more, yeah.
Thanks, Ollie. Just a quick one. Thank you, Minister. A quick question on something closer to home for myself. We're not just talking about Brexit, of course. We're talking about the entire United Kingdom, that the implication of the vote for the island of Ireland is significant. And do you have any views on what implications Brexit, Uxit, whatever we want to call it, will have with the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and what implications it might be for trade?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and there are potentially complex questions in relation to Ireland. But bear in mind, of course, we haven't made the decisions yet on things like the customs union and all these other questions, yeah? But what I would say is I think where the goodwill, and I don't think there's anybody closer in international relations today than the UK and the Republic of Ireland. And I think where there is goodwill across a border, normally that is the quantity that is most in sort of a scant resource around the world. And bear in mind, of course, the UK and the Republic of Ireland had complete ease of moving across the border, both goods, services and people, even before either of us joined the European Union. So I think with the goodwill in place, both sides wanting there not to be an obstacle, notwithstanding that some of those key questions have yet to be addressed, I'm confident that we can find a good solution that will suit the people of the United Kingdom, including the people of Northern Ireland, and the people of the Irish Republic, I think, going forward from here. Because you're right, the Republic of Ireland is actually, I think, our third or fourth largest export market from the UK. I think I'm right in saying we export more to Ireland than we currently do to India, for example. So it's very, very important that we don't put any barriers in the way of that trade.
Okay, the final question from in the very centre here, Professor John Dunn. If you just pass the microphone along, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask two questions, but very quickly. The first is, are you privy to why the Prime Minister decided that it was advantageous to begin what's bound to be a very complicated negotiation and difficult
Sorry,
negotiation?
I'm not hearing well, sir.
Are you privy to why the Prime Minister decided that it was wise to begin what's bound to be a very complicated negotiation by the end of March next year? And does the government have any view about what it would be appropriate for it to do should it become clear in the course of the 2 years, at least, that the negotiation would take, that the balance of opinion and sentiment in the population had shifted sharply?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, let me try and take the wise, if I understood the question, whether it was wise to give a date for when we would trigger Article 50 by. I think ultimately that's a balance. You know, you need to get on with it. I think uncertainty is a big factor, particularly for businesses. Businesses don't like uncertainty. Equally, you want to maintain a certain amount of flexibility. Ultimately, you want to trigger Article 50 when you think that you will be ready, that you will have all the answers to the questions that we have in terms of the priorities for that negotiation. Now, I've done an intergovernmental negotiation before. I negotiated the fiscal framework with Scotland between the UK government and the Scottish government. And intergovernmental negotiations are complex things. The most important thing of which is you've got to know in advance what are your objectives and what are the areas that you're willing to compromise on. And it's very bad practice to start a negotiation until you've really worked out those two things. I think the need to telegraph sort of a timetable on that with still a degree of flexibility has been the right decision. And what to do, I think if I understood you correctly, what to do if public opinion changes within the 2 years? Well, I think the answer is not to hold a second referendum, I can tell you that. I think the answer is actually to deliver on what the people said on the 23rd of June and to make sure we get the best possible deal working all together, bringing as many people on board as that we possibly can to seek the best possible deal for the United Kingdom. Bearing in mind, of course, the 2-year limit within Article 50 as well, and making sure that we get the best possible deal. But I don't think the answer, the British people, I think, spoke clearly on the 23rd of June. I don't think the answer is to go back to the British people and seek a second opinion on that, because I think that's the sort of thing that will throw up bigger problems than the one we're trying to overcome in the first place.
Before we give the Minister a very warm thank you for his lecture, let me say that we have a drinks reception afterwards. As you exit this theatre, what looks a bit like the first floor, if you go out those 2 back doors, then that's where the drinks reception will be. And let me thank very, very warmly Greg Hands for coming here, for giving us his time, for being very generous with questions. He will be having drinks as well, and so if you've got questions, do try and catch him then. But before we all leave, let's give him a very warm thank you from all of us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good. Yeah.